Good evening and welcome to the historic Wayne Theater Ross Performing Arts Center. My name is Tracy Strait. I have the privilege of being the executive director here, and on behalf of our board of directors, our staff, and our awesome ambassadors, those are our treasured volunteers, we thank you so much for joining us for our signature speaker series for science, and we'd like to welcome to all of you joining us virtually through the live stream. Coming up at the Wayne Theater will be 10 performances of Something Rotten. It opens on April 21st, and 10 performances, matinees and evening performances that will run through May 1st. So please check out our website for that. Also, we begin our Wayne on Main concert summer series the last Wednesday of the month, April through September. Coming right up, yes, with Spencer Hatcher and the good old Sun Gang. So please join us as we kick off. It's going to be a fun summer right here. The block is closed off here at the Wayne. Mall Pass Brother tickets are on sale. And play Vanya, Sonia, Masha, and Spike, which will be in the Custon Cabaret. We have flyers that you can pick up if you are here in person. And we also have everything listed on our website at waynetheater.org. We're constantly adding to this, as in even today, we have added the Air Force Jazz Band on May the 15th, an afternoon performance. So you'll see that coming onto our website soon. So please keep checking back often. Thank you so much for joining us. And now here's Tom Benzing, who will introduce our speaker for this evening.
Thank you, Tracy, and welcome everybody that's in the audience tonight, as well as those of you that are joining us online. I certainly want to start off by thanking our sponsors for this series, the Wayne Theater, the South River Science Team, the Center for Cold Waters Restoration, and our Virginia Museum of Natural History. And this is actually the last talk in our series for the year, so if those of you that are in the audience tonight or online want to share some ideas for speakers you'd like to see in the coming season, we're open to that, and I think we have a sign-in sheet in the lobby if you want to put down your name and any suggestions you might have. I wanted to give you a brief update on where the Waynesboro campus for the Virginia Museum of Natural History stands. We're currently partnering with an architect and engineering exhibit design firm that has long experience in cultural projects. And after interviewing 4 excellent teams last month, in fact, we chose a firm for the quality of their work in building design and exhibit success, and because of their long working relationships with the Commonwealth of Virginia. We expect them to bring excellence and excitement to this new campus of the museum here in Waynesboro, right on the banks of South River, in partnership with the state to ensure it's an environmentally responsible project and to provide a long-lasting design. And we're currently in negotiations with that firm. As soon as those negotiations conclude, we'll be able to announce that publicly, and we will invite them to come here to learn more about Waynesboro and certainly to meet the stakeholders. And anyone that's in the room, just watch for public announcements of opportunities to do that. We certainly want to engage with the community as we go into this stage of the design. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Jonathan Miles. He's a colleague of mine up at JMU in our School of Integrated Sciences. And in fact, we started long ago in the same year. John comes with a PhD in mechanical engineering from UMass Amherst, and he serves as the executive director for the Center for the Advancement of Sustainable Energy at JMU. He also serves as professor in residence at Waynesboro High School, and he and I share that role. He supports engineering and math curricula there, and he serves on the board of the Center for Cold Waters Restoration. So please join me in welcoming John to the stage.
Thank you, Tom. Sometimes at JMU they call me the poor man's Tom Benzing, but I get over that. No, thank you very much. As Tom said, we arrived, I believe, same year, same day, and it's been we've had many opportunities to work together. Most recently, for several years now, as professors in residence at Waynesboro High School. I like to tell people that Tom deals with the wet science, I deal with the dry science, but combined, we hope that we have some positive impacts with the teachers and the students over there, particularly in the sciences and math and also CTE education. So my talk here tonight, Tangier Island, an opportunity to enhance energy resilience in a remote island community. And I want to mention here that perhaps my role as Executive Director at the Center for the Advancement of Sustainable Energy is the one that's more relevant to my talk tonight. What is the Center for the Advancement of Sustainable Energy? Well, it's an academic center, at least by name, at JMU. We have quite a lot of academic centers. And the purpose of the centers is largely to provide faculty an outlet for conducting research and to combine forces on various projects of mutual interest. Our center's a little bit different. And it was created a number of years ago largely to be responsive to the needs of our state energy office in its interest in trying to drive forward energy policy according to whatever the legislative mandate happens to be at the time. And if you're not aware of this, at the moment, actually effective 2020, we have legislation in Virginia through the Virginia Clean Economy Act that mandates that we transition to 100% carbon-free electricity throughout the state by 2050. And the state has taken it very seriously. Our state energy office has as well. And one of our roles is to look for the opportunities for deployment of clean energy sources. Dominion's doing really a stand-up job right now in retiring their coal plants and advancing offshore wind energy. We're going to see the first large U.S. wind farm in federal waters starting to be developed within the next year or two. They've been building solar for more than half a decade now all over the state. But the reality is that if we're going to get to that goal, we're going to have to look within every nook and cranny and find even the smaller opportunities, which is what I'm going to address a little bit here tonight in the context of Tangier. So I've made some introductions. Tom has made an introduction. Thank you again, Tom. So let me get you oriented. Before I do, just a quick question, show of hands. Has anybody been to Tangier Island? That's excellent. Okay, so some of you, this is going to be a little bit repetitive, but sorry? We're going there. You're going there. Well, great. So for those of you who are going there, hopefully this will get you a little bit oriented in advance. I think you're going to have a great time. After my talk, I'm happy to give you a few pointers, suggestions while you're there. Bring your walking shoes, among other things. So for those who aren't sure, and I was just asked this question a few minutes ago, where's Tangier Island? It's in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay. And is it accessible? It is if you've got some time to drive and you're willing to get on a boat. I'd say door to door from around here, you're looking at 5 to 6 hours if you're going by way of Crisfield, Maryland. In the summer months, you can get a boat from the west side of the Chesapeake Bay and save yourself an hour or two. And that's a little closer look at Tangier. So Tangier Island's over on this side. Let me just bring the oval in. There's Tangier Island, and just to the north, you've got Smith Island. So these are two populated islands. I think the only two populated islands in the Chesapeake, at least of this size and magnitude, remaining. And they are served electricity-wise by a subsea power cable that originates at Anancock on the eastern shore. That cable runs through Watts Island. It's not really quite a straight line like I've sketched here. And then there's an additional line that goes up to Smith Island. And one of the challenges that is being experienced right now by ANEC, that would be Accomack Northampton Electric Cooperative, they're the ones who deliver the power and maintain the cable, is that the cable has had some failures in recent years, and it is getting close to the end of life. And that raises the question, is there a more cost-effective and perhaps a cleaner energy solution to replacing that cable once it needs to be replaced? So it's something we've looked at for quite a number of years. A couple more views of Tangier. So again, to get you oriented, this is an aerial view from the southern side of Tangier Island. So if you go, let me go back to the slide just for a moment. You'll notice here that Tangier looks like a bit of a crescent, And on the right side, there's a small landmass considered part of Tangier, but known as Port Isabel. So going back to this view, you've got Tangier on the left, kind of a crescent with this tail. That's nothing more than beach. And then on the right-hand side, Port Isabel. Port Isabel is and has been for a number of decades now owned by the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. This is one of their several centers scattered around the region where they conduct training and education and do the work that they do. So Port Isabel is a smaller landmass, but one that we're even more interested in as far as this project's concerned because unlike Tangier, it's several feet above sea level versus most of Tangier, which rarely gets to be a foot over sea level. There's, again, a view from the south. You see better now, a better perspective with a couple of the ridges where more of the residential buildings are constructed. There's 3 ridges along here, the airport in the distance. You get a good sense here of just how marshy much of Tangier is these days. And then over to the right, Port Isabel. I'm going to turn us around 180 degrees and now look from the northwest. And the most prominent feature you notice here, of course, is the airport. There isn't much of an airport there, but it's enough to get small planes in and out, and that's especially important, airplanes or helicopters, if there needs to be any kind of a medical evacuation. And a little bit of a seawall along here, intended, of course, to stave off, to the extent possible, erosion and more loss of land. So you again, you get the sense of the 3 ridges, the 3 main roads along here, and over to the east side, and then various channels and marshland in between. I don't know how well you can see it from where you are, but I'm going to show you some other images. That's the school right there. There's the water tower, and this is the main channel, and where a lot of the watermen have their docks and where they bring in their catch. So a few more. There's a closer look at the channel where the watermen come in and out and where they have individually their houses. There's another look much closer at the more populated part of Tangier. You see up in here, if I would call anything on Tangier an urban center, this is roughly where it would be in that region there. You've got a couple of restaurants. Actually, on this side is where you have maybe 2 or so remaining bed and breakfasts, a fire department, small police building as well, a small medical facility, and a few other municipal resources as well. There's a closer look at the school. That serves all grades. I visited there with a graduate student in December so that she could have a good look at the island as she was finishing her work, which I'm going to reference shortly. And we had the opportunity to meet with a couple of the teachers and the principal and the senior class of 5 students. So it's a very small population. This building was elevated, as you can tell here, and is now on stilts in order to anticipate that water is going to be more and more encroaching on the island. Just a nice view of the marshes. This, in fact, is the medical center. What's beside the medical center might make one a little bit concerning on their way in for treatment. But actually, you'll see this when you visit Tangier, if you've been to Tangier. It's not uncommon in backyards, side yards of homes and other buildings to see cemeteries. And one of the things you'll notice, this speaks a little bit to the history of the island, is you'll read probably on the order of 5 or 6 very common, most common last names. There aren't many more beyond that. Let's see, a couple other pictures. The Tangier History Museum, that opened up about 10 or so years ago. When you visit, take the time, if you can, to go to the History Museum. It's really quite stunning. They did a terrific job of capturing, going back generations. Starting about a dozen years ago, there was an effort for a couple of years to gather materials from the families on Tangier. And the folks who did that, who led that effort, did a fine job of it. And then finally here, and this is one of the reasons why we were there, is to understand better the electrical infrastructure of the island. So this is the substation, electric power station, if you will, where the power comes in by cable from the mainland, and then it is distributed across the island. There's another power line that goes to the north and then ultimately goes underwater up to Smith Island and then across the harbor to serve Port Isabel as well. By the way, I should have said this at the beginning. Don't hesitate to just put your hand up if you have any questions as I go along here, but I'll plenty of time for Q&A after as well. Yes, sir.
Back on the school, you said there were 5 seniors.
Five seniors, yes.
Are there more eligible students on the island, but they are sent off the island to go to a private school? Or
My understanding is that
more than 5 eligible?
no, I don't think there are. And my understanding is that the vast majority, if not all of the students on Tangier, stay on Tangier, at least for their schooling. There is a concern that the population on Tangier is aging. Fewer of the younger generation are staying on Tangier, following in their parents' and grandparents' footsteps as watermen and women. And we had the opportunity to talk to each of the seniors while we were there. Only, I'd say, 2 or 3 of them intend to stay on the island. Those who go off and go to college may or may not come back. 2 of them were going to be working on the water, I think initially driving tugboats. And one was going to work for a co-op, not ANEC, but another one of the, he was going to be a lineman. And I think the other 2 were going off to college. So a little bit more about Tangier, and a shameless plug for a gentleman who some of you may have encountered at some time. He's local in Afton, Earl Swift. You know Earl or know of Earl? If you've ever had the chance to read any of his books, I highly recommend them. He was a journalist with the Virginia Pilot for a number of years. He's been an author of books on varying subjects for a number of years, and he published this several years ago, and it's really an exceptional account of Tangier. He writes it in the present. He embedded himself for over a year on Tangier several years ago, but he goes back and forth in time and really, I think, does a very nice job of characterizing the island and the population and explaining why the Tangier population is the way they are. And particularly, it taught me a lot about their approach to climate change and to some of the challenges that they're experiencing today and why they might be inclined to resist some of the solutions that would be brought to them. It's a town in Accomack County on Tangier Island. The population has been there for several hundred years, and their livelihood is driven almost exclusively by fishing. And these are just some of the statistics that might be relevant. A couple years old, but the poverty rate is 17%. Median income, $41,000. Median property value, $95,000. And employed population is about half the population, 250. One of the reasons we're looking at this right now, what I'm going to be introducing, an energy solution that might replace the subsea cable, is because particularly with interest at the federal level in infrastructure, and speaking to potential energy solutions that involve wind and solar power, there's particular interest among our state and federal agencies to bring solutions to impoverished communities. And this Tangier is characterized as an impoverished community. So we're hoping that that's going to give us some leverage in trying to secure funds to bring some energy solutions to Tangier, but I'll get back to that. Those who have visited Tangier, you recognize a very unique accent and dialect. Some think it sounds a little bit Cockney, a little bit Southern, a little hybrid of the two, but when you visit, you'll, I think, get the same sense that most of us do, which is I've never heard that accent before, and I don't ever expect to hear it anywhere else. So it really sort of encapsulates just how unique this community is. And there's a lot more to that, historical context that I think is important to try to preserve. The island was once much larger. You'll see this in a moment. and had woodlands. But there isn't much left, of course, much remaining in terms of any tall vegetation at this point, except for on Port Isabel. The community is quite resilient. They have been through a number of challenging times, and in more recent years, within the last century, some storms that may or may not have driven some of the population away. It is a difficult place to live, particularly in the winter. And in the colder winters, maybe not so much in recent years, they've even been iced in and had to have icebreakers come out and clear channels for transportation by water. So speaking of resilience, some of you may have seen this. This dates back to 2016 in the New York Times Magazine. And this wasn't the first time that a major publication wrote on Tangier Island, and particularly spoke to whether this kind of a community in this area is worthy of saving, if you will, or trying to assist a community like this in dealing with the challenges of rising sea level and erosion and all the things that might over some time require the population of Tangier to abandon the island and move and live elsewhere. In this particular article, this was the conflict between, do we save this? Do we recognize the value of the community, the culture, the history of Tangier. Even the land mass itself presents great value in terms of providing habitat for migrating species and other and endangered species. But then when you do the math and consider the economics of what would it take to try to maintain this landmass beyond the 50 or so years that's anticipated to still be viable, it's very expensive. So it's a difficult proposition, and Earl speaks quite eloquently on this topic. So Tangier has lost 2/3 of its landmass since 1850. You see in green what Tangier would have looked like over 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 170 years ago. And where we are roughly today, that's 2013. It has shrunk a little bit more since then. They're losing land every year still. I'll just point out here what's remaining. If I can get there we go. This is the portion of Tangier that still hosts houses and structures and the daily life of the Tangier community. This region here is referred to as the upwards. There haven't been houses on the upwards in decades. And then, of course, Port Isabel to the right. These are all quotes from the New York Times Magazine article, warmer global temperatures making oceans bigger, increasing sea levels, at the same time land-based glaciers around the world, along with the ice caps, of course, melting. And this is one of the challenges that I've experienced, Earl has experienced, and others have experienced with the Tangier community. They're not accepting that climate change is leading to ocean rise. Their position still is, it's erosion, and erosion can be solved. What we need is, we need essentially breakwaters. We need infrastructure around the island. They'd like to see a big wall around the island and protect the island from erosion. But they're not comfortable at all at this point with the idea that we're seeing rising sea level, and that's ultimately going to be, or potentially going to spell the end of Tangier as a residential community. Land in and around the Chesapeake is sinking because of effects from geological events dating back 20,000 years. And they recognize that this is a problem. But again, they're not accepting that the problem is necessarily related to climate change and rising sea levels. And I think the bottom line here, and I alluded to this already, and it's articulated very well by the New York Times, this would probably require a monumental investment to maintain Tangier for the long haul. So, I don't want to get too far away from the main points of my talk here, but this is something we're considering when we're talking about investing in infrastructure. Now, the energy infrastructure we have in mind has on the order of a 20 to 25 year lifetime. So maybe there's the possibility by introducing a very novel demonstration project that would solve the energy problem for Tangier, that attracts more attention from the federal government and gives the federal government more reason to want to try to maintain this community. But again, I don't want to get too far off course right now. So why are we interested in Tangier? Well, as I mentioned already, this community is culturally and historically very significant. There was legislation that passed about 10 or more years ago that set the course for how solar and wind projects are permitted in Virginia. And that legislation called on the Department of Environmental Quality to establish what's known as a permit by rule. And it's a very clear set of guidelines for how large solar and wind projects would be permitted. And the language of the legislation starts with developing this in a manner that's going to protect our cultural and historic resources. So that's very clearly an important factor when we're talking about energy, and presumably would be as well when we're talking about how and whether we want to maintain and protect a community of this sort. So we're accustomed in the solar and wind world to be thinking about how do we do this in a way that's sensitive to those resources. The island community, as I mentioned already, is dependent on an electrical infrastructure under the water that has already demonstrated that it's aging, has failed on a couple of occasions. I should add, there are generators on both islands, Tangier and Smith, that serve as backup when this happens, but they are very expensive to operate. They're dirty generators. They're not the most desirable solution, and certainly not for the long term. We've already done quite a bit of measurements ourselves, particularly with wind, and you'll see some photos of that in a moment. And those measurements and the analysis shows that the resources certainly are appropriate for this kind of a project. Solar, wind, energy storage, and microgrid technologies are reliable and cost-effective. I'll talk more about those in just a second. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we have a mandate in Virginia now to transition toward 100% clean energy. It's got to be done. For that reason and a lot of other reasons, as I'm sure you're all aware. And again, at the center, that's one of our goals, is to try to find various solutions to help us along in that direction. So a clean power microgrid at Tangier would provide energy resilience and reliability and would address demonstration and workforce development needs as well. And I can elaborate more on that later. What's a microgrid? Well, microgrid is almost self-explanatory. It is, think of this as an infrastructure that we're all accustomed to, at least knowing about and seeing components of. That is a generator, might be a coal plant or a gas plant or a solar facility. And the wires that transmit and distribute the electricity to where it needs to go to the loads. And these days, wind and solar projects, when they're built, often are built with large battery storage. And I say battery, I don't mean in your phone or in your electric vehicle. I'm talking about batteries or battery sets that fill what would be equivalent to a container on a ship. And now imagine these containers, and they're all stacked up and they're all lined up. So we're talking about batteries that can drive load on the grid for periods of minutes or hours or even days. If you have a community like Tangier that may at some point become isolated from the grid, and you collect generators, can be gas generators, diesel, but can be wind and solar as well, and battery sets, and all of the electronics and the controls that can coordinate the operation of all of those, you've got now a very reliable source of electricity. Again, a microgrid can be driven by fossil, but it can be driven by solar and wind as well. And our pitch here is, let us help you, the Tangier community, prepare for a transition to self-generation using clean energy sources, indigenous resources that are right there at the island, in a manner that's going to take away your reliance on a grid or a connection that ultimately is going to fail. And it's going to cost in the millions, if not tens of millions, to replace. I'm sorry?
Who will operate the grid?
A microgrid would be autonomous. It would operate, it would be monitored, presumably by ANAC. They would have a probably good reason to want to, if not own it, at least operate it. And one of the premises that we're operating under is that if this were to come to fruition within, say, a couple of years, and that cable is still operating, that gives us the opportunity as well to send clean power back to the mainland as well. But generally speaking, the microgrids, the electronics and the controls have reached a point of sophistication and reliability that they don't really need anybody to control them.
Yeah, but they wouldn't send clean energy back before the batteries were charged.
Correct. Yeah, in this scenario, you'd have a microgrid, the primary load of which would be the Tangier and Smith communities. And then the secondary would be to bring perhaps peaking power over to the mainland as well. So we've been here before, and when I say we, I mean our center. There's Tangier and Port Isabel again. But I want to draw your attention to Port Isabel. I mentioned that the Chesapeake Bay Foundation owns the island, and they use it for teaching, education, training purposes. But most of their activity occurs right in here. They've got docks over here, several boats and skiffs, and there are a number of buildings here that serve administration, dining and housing, classroom space. That big barn right there is where they keep tractors and some other heavy equipment and quite an impressive assortment of tools and so on. So they're most interested in using this space in here, which leaves a wide open space over here. Now, I mentioned before, one of the highest elevations across the entire land masses. That's because for years and years before this was no longer allowed, dredge spoil was dropped on top of Port Isabel. So it's, I think, 4, maybe 5 feet at its highest. And of course, that had us thinking, well, if we were ever to bring wind and solar out here, maybe we need to focus our attention on Port Isabel. Higher elevation, less likely to be affected by, or not as likely to be affected by rising sea level for a longer period of time. And there's already an electrical connection established between Port Isabel and the electricity substation. So we were asked by the State Energy Office around 2007 or 8, hey, what can we do to help this community? And I suggested, well, one thing that we could do is we could start measuring the wind out there, because although there are online resources and modeling tools and so on and so forth, when it comes to using wind as a source of energy, the gold standard always is direct measurement. At that time, we were running a program at JMU through our center. We had about 15 towers that we were deploying all over the state. We probably over 10 years hit 40 or 50 different locations. And we were measuring the wind so that we'd understand where the more lucrative wind generating opportunities were in the state. This particular tower that we deployed stood about 50 meters, 165 feet. And a dozen years ago, that was the standard measuring height for wind turbines. These days it's 80 because turbines have gotten so much larger and are deployed on taller towers as well. So I was out there with a group of students and our staff. I think there were 7 or 8 of us, 2.5 days to get this tower up. It was quite an adventure, good learning experience for the students. Little precarious at times. I get nervous when we're raising a tower of this magnitude. It's, safety concerns and all, but they're well trained and disciplined, and we were able to get that tower standing. That stood from about 2009. We brought that tower down about 10 years later, 2019, we brought it down. Measured wind over that period of time, and that gave us all the data we needed to know and to understand that wind energy generation was viable and could be cost effective on the island. The Chesapeake Bay Foundation was very cooperative. Their staff went out and gathered the data chips for us, emailed us the data, did everything that they could to keep that tower operating, keep the instruments operating over that period of time. And that's a better view of the tower that was taken just a few years ago, a couple of years before we took it down. So we get to know Port Isabel a little bit better as well, and we got to know the staff at CBF, and you may know this already, but CBF as an organization is a very strong supporter of clean energy. And the notion of the sole generation of electricity for Tangier and Smith Islands being installed at Port Isabel was actually quite appealing to them and continues to be. So we're envisioning a partnership with these folks should this project move forward. And this is, I don't want to bore you with a lot of data, but these are the kinds of reports that we get from the software that allows us to take the data that's collected over that period of time and understand a little bit about the wind resource. And what this shows you, just to give you an idea of why this is useful, these give us some sense of how the wind varies over the year, much stronger in the wintertime, weaker in the summertime, and that there's these diurnal daily variations in the wind as well. These are called wind roses, and they show us that the more consistent winds are coming out of the northwest or the south-southwest. And this chart here is simply what we call a wind frequency distribution, and it gives us a sense of how many hours out of the year is the wind at a particular speed. So we see the most common wind speed on the order of 8-9 meters per second, and that's good. In the industry, that would be considered a viable wind resource. And I promise that's the end of the data. So we were at a point 2 years ago, we thought we've got the data now, we've got these ideas, we had met with the Tangier community, they're interested in this as an alternative. And then, as luck would have it, Tom and I have a colleague who has spent years working with a couple of German universities, and through that connection, he has, each year we get an email from Steve, and Steve says, all right, I got a couple of German students who would like to do a master's degree. Anybody interested? Here's what they're interested in. And I was connected with a young woman who had already earned her engineering degree, wanted to learn more about microgrids, and was interested in integrating microgrids with solar and wind. So it's a match made in heaven. Rabia came on board. We worked together remotely through COVID. Her visit, her time in the US was of course delayed, but she came over, and just last week she presented this thesis to me and her other graduate advisors. And she did a lot of the analysis of the data and modeling of a microgrid that is now going to help us go to funding agencies and make a credible case for why we should go forward with the more, shall we say, tangible analysis and study that is required before you'd go to installation. And of course, that's also going to involve quite a bit of interaction with the community as well to make sure they understand what the impacts on their community might be should a project like this get built. So Rabia's conclusions, and this is all based on science and analysis, is that there is, well, we had an inkling, by looking at the data in a cursory way, but the modeling suggests that there is excellent potential for solar photovoltaics and for wind power. And to mate those with battery storage, that the reliability of power supply could be increased by deployment of a microgrid, by removing what I would consider to be the most likely source of failure, and that's going to be the subsea cable. Of course, reduction in emissions by replacing fossil fuel generation that is the driver for most of what they're receiving now. And again, when they lose contact with the mainland, they turn to even more polluting and less reliable electricity generation from their own generators. That electricity costs can be decreased. This is maybe the most important factor for the Tangier and Smith communities, particularly if federal funding is available through FEMA, through our Virginia Department of Emergency Management, through a program called BRIC, Building Resiliency in Communities, that targets in particular remote and impoverished communities. If our federal government is willing to foot the bill or a large part of the bill for a project like this, the resultant cost for electricity for this community decreases significantly. So that's a major driver. And then finally, a cost-efficient, clean, resilient alternative to replacement of the cable. If we get a project in the near term and the cable's still there, then that's a more flexible system and a more cost-effective system. but if the cable goes away, at least these two communities remain with power. So our next steps here are proposals for state and or federal funding. These communities are already supplied by ANN. The power cable is nearing end of life. There's got to be a solution to this, and we see this as a more cost-effective solution than replacing that cable. Prime candidates for alternative power sources, because these are communities that are already in a region where both solar and wind would work well. That's uncommon. Solar is a pretty good resource in most of Virginia, but the wind isn't always available or isn't always strong and steady enough for cost-effective wind generation. In most of Virginia, it's in the highlands, it's along the ridges, areas that in Virginia, more often than not, are not available for development for a number of reasons. Among them, of course, they're state or federally owned. But along the coast and in the Chesapeake, the wind is very good for this purpose, as is solar. So we have pitched the idea of staging most of the equipment, solar in the same area where we had our tower, wind possibly along here or maybe along this side of the island, and then using Port Isabel as the location for generating all of the power for Tangier and Smith Islands. Tangier, Smith Island communities present an appropriate and exceptional opportunity for deployment of a microgrid, also for the purpose of demonstration. The federal government, microgrids are now coming of age, but there are not a lot of them yet. And they're identified as a particularly good solution for remote areas, or areas where, of course, where the wind and solar is good if you want a clean microgrid, but areas where getting connections from the grid are more costly or are impractical. And for that reason, what we're also hearing is if we can do this on a remote island community, that's particularly interesting for a demonstration project. So we recognize that as well. I won't read them off for you, but what we are getting ready to propose is a 12-month effort, and this would involve industry as well. And in green and blue, these are the kinds of activities that effort would include. So some of that is technical work, some of that is going to require visits to the island, survey work. We're going to have to understand all the ramifications as far as Virginia regulations and federal regulations are concerned. And I never want to underestimate, in fact, I always want to emphasize there's going to be a lot of communications that have to go on with these communities and with the other stakeholders that are going to be concerned, and rightly so, about whether a project like this might have undesirable impacts on wildlife and other resources at Tangier. So what are the benefits, or who will the mitigation activity of this sort benefit? We see this benefiting, of course, the island community itself. Our final report, if we're able to proceed with this, is going to provide the template for full design and engineering and construction of the project. And all the residents and services associated with these communities will be impacted and will benefit in ways that I've already described. One other, I didn't put it in writing here, but another thing that came up in our conversation at the school in December, and it's come up with some of the other folks in Tangier. I mentioned early in my talk here, the younger generation, I guess for lack of a better way of saying it, is losing interest in following in their parents' and grandparents' footsteps. I've gotten to know some of the watermen there, and Earl articulates this very well in his book. That's a very, very hard life. These are folks who have to rely on a market that goes up and down, a resource that goes up and down, requires going out, getting up at 2, 3 in the morning. It's a real tough life. Yet the younger generation still, by the time they're high school aged, are very, very comfortable on the water. They know how to operate vessels. They know how to operate safely. So we hope that should infrastructure like this be built, it might serve as an attractor for that younger generation who's comfortable on the water, because as some of you may be reading in the last year or two, Virginia has very actively tried to position itself as the mid-Atlantic, if not eastern seaboard hub for the offshore wind industry that's just getting going. Siemens Gamesa in Europe One of only a handful of manufacturers of the largest wind turbines announced just months ago that they're going to invest in the first blade manufacturing facility in Hampton Roads. The state has invested in upgrading ports for this purpose. So what's next? Well, the workforce. We are way behind on having an adequate workforce to keep up with the industry the way it's projected to grow. And so what we hope is, although it's a very small community, maybe the Tangier community could benefit in that way if that younger generation sees opportunities to stay where they are and to live and to grow in Tangier, yet get on a boat and go be deployed for a week or two to do maintenance on turbines or install turbines or whatever else. So that's sort of a side benefit that we have been discussing with this community. And that's the end of my talk. So I want to thank you very much for your interest in the topic, and I am very happy to take some questions.
Thank you, John. Let me walk around with the microphone so we can hear everybody's questions.
So will Smith Island be included in this
Yes.
microgrid?
Yeah, the modeling, I didn't want to
Yeah.
to burden you with a lot of the technical details that Rabia worked up, but all of her modeling assumed that the load to be served would include Smith Island as well. Smith, with the exception of their 2 diesel generators, just as Tangier has 2 generators, that's it. They don't have any other sources, and they rely on the electrical staff on Tangier maintaining that connection all the way up to Smith. Yes, sir.
Okay, so it sounded like you said they would continue to have even with the microgrid of clean energy, they would have the backup generators.
Yeah.
So I guess a couple questions related to that is, how much currently do those backup generators operate just because of sort of the problems that they've had with the cable? Like, I don't, by percentage of the time, how much of that, or percentage of energy? And then just even on your 10 years of wind modeling, do you sort of anticipate, we just expect X percent of the energy has to come from backup because, conditions occasionally line up that they can't produce? So is
Sure.
there a sense of that difference? Old regime, new regime.
Yeah.
And then I have a totally separate question after that if I can, but start with that.
No, that's okay. So let me elaborate on this a little bit. Everybody in the room understands that wind and solar are intermittent generating sources. And for a number of years, that was one of the reasons you'd hear pushback from the utilities, for instance. Oh, we can't handle that because we can't switch it on and off when we need it. Well, that's not entirely true. They can manage demand being variable. They know how to manage the generation being variable, and they have figured it out. The idea of a microgrid is you've got to have the storage as well. And you can always rely 100% on your wind and solar if you have enough wind and or solar capacity and you build enough storage. So it becomes an optimization problem, and this is exactly what our graduate student was working on, building the model and then testing all different configurations of numbers of turbines, numbers of panels, capacity of storage in different scenarios. What if we don't want to ever have to worry about the cable at all? What if we don't ever want to switch on the generators? Now the generators are there, and this is sort of the trade-off that we were exploring is, all right, if we have the generators, we can rely on a smaller battery, smaller number of batteries. That might be desirable if we want to keep the costs down. But if the government's paying for the batteries, all right, it would be nice not to have to turn on the generators. It really is, well, I'll just give you some sense of what we came up with for a solution, which is we're looking at 2 to 3 intermediate-sized turbines on Port Isabel, and probably on the order of 3 to 4 acres of solar, coupled with a battery size that is to be determined, again, based on how independent does the island want to be of those generators or the cable. Now, I'll add one more element to this, and I think this gets more directly to your question. The generators don't operate that frequently. Failures are, I mean, when I say failure, it's only happened a couple times so far, but they're anticipating more because of the age of the cable. However, the generators are used more frequently to send power back to the mainland for peaking purposes, and that happens in the summer and the hottest days. So there's an interest within the co-op to maintain the ability to bring power back onto the mainland. That speaks to another opportunity. All right, well, if you can deploy enough solar and wind to power the Tangier and Smith communities, can we upgrade that a little bit and maintain even more generation onto the mainland when it's called upon or when we need it? And if it's clean power, then they may say, well, we'll take all you can give us at all times.
So is that, just to follow on to that, is it easily scalable the way you're doing it? So like, oh, we can add one more tower.
Yes.
And
It's easily scalable to the extent of how much land you have, which obviously I didn't say this, but the other reason besides elevation we prefer Port Isabel over Tangier is, quite frankly, most of the driest land on Tangier is already occupied. The other issue with the wind turbines is you've got an airport. And we've been down this road with the Department of Aviation a few years ago when we were first talking about this. And the guidance at that point was, all right, get as far away from the airport as you can. And Port Isabel fits that bill just fine.
okay, so my other kind of wholly unrelated question.
Yeah.
You're talking about the alternative green energy to replace the electric energy uses on the island. And obviously, this is part of climate issues, but do you have any sense of how much of total energy being used by the community is like electricity versus like fuel for watercraft activity?
I don't have much knowledge at all as far as fuel used for their activities on the water. I can say this, most of their load on the island is electrical. The most common mode of transportation, as anybody would know who's been there, is golf cart. Those are all electric. There are a handful of gas-powered vehicles on the island, small pickup trucks, things of that sort. Their major energy loads are for waste and for pumping, water pumping, water filtration, typical municipal loads. And their heating isn't exclusively electrical through heat pumps, but their primary energy would be electrical. For some of it is heating, all of it, of course, for cooling, lighting, cooking, etc. There's some gas on the island as well.
Question in the back, then I'll come back to you.
This is more a relational query. How big are those 3 islands in half mile, 2 miles?
I'd say the
Square footage?
I just saw this stat recently, a new one. I'd say the width of the island from the airport on the west side to the electrical infrastructure on the right side, 1/4 mile, maybe on that order.
1,000 feet?
Yeah, maybe between 1/4 and 1/2 on that order. And north to south, from from the channel down to maybe the last residence, I'd say that's between 1/2 and 3/4 mile.
Okay. That gives you an idea as far as, like you said, golf carts are the mode of transportation and
Best
walking.
mode of transportation. Walking even better, yeah.
Yeah.
You could walk from one side of the island from the airport over to the east side in 10 minutes, comfortably or less.
Okay. What is the population of the island there? Total population?
Depends who you ask. I have gotten different numbers from the town manager and from various sources online. I hear numbers anywhere from about 350 to 500. And Smith, I think, is comparable.
Yeah, I noticed on the one slide you had it was about 500 something.
That slide, but there are some lower estimates as well. Yeah.
Why not build on Smith?
Sorry?
Why not build the grid on Smith?
Build the equipment on Smith?
Yeah, or
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Our focus, our attention has been on Tangier largely because it's a Virginia community, and we serve Virginia, and Smith is in Maryland. But they don't have a Port Isabel, and we see great value in the partnership with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. Not only are they interested in hosting it, but they see an opportunity to add education on clean energy to their repertoire out there as well, if the equipment is right there on the island. The power, the central location from where the power goes is on Tangier. We're right across the harbor from Port Isabel. So.
Well, the company operating, is there a line, is Maryland anyhow?
Yeah, that line, that particular line would need to be maintained either way, whether the power's coming from Anancock or coming or being self-generated at Tangier.
So you haven't looked at whether there's any place that's appropriate on the
No, and Smith is a lot like Tangier in the sense of very low elevation and sort of quite a lot of marshland and opportunity for flooding. Yes?
Yes, my question is, I think earlier in your talk you mentioned that perhaps the residents weren't convinced that climate change was an issue, if I understood you correctly. And I was wondering if the community, the residents on Tangier Island are aware of your proposal, and you know, at the moment, would you say most of them are against it, for it, somewhere in the middle?
I would say more are for it. Our interactions are mostly with the town manager and the board and the mayor. And they have been 100% supportive of the concept. They like the idea a lot. And I think that it's mostly because they see value in the project. They would not be interested if it were to cause them more financial hardship than they already deal with. So if this can, I'd say of all the criteria one might consider for a project like this, any economic benefit that it delivers would be by far the most appealing attribute for a project like this. But I've learned long ago, and Earl has backed me up on this, and others, don't conflate this with climate change. Just leave that discussion for another day or for another person, because if you start to get into that becomes that's a sensitive topic for them. So we just don't go there. Yeah.
Another question in the back here, and then maybe a couple more, and we'll
Sure.
wrap it up.
Yeah.
Totally squirrely question, but in colonial times, the grist mills were all powered by the tide. Creeks would, at high tide, they would impound the water. It would turn the wheel. Is there any viable designs that would consider tidal electrical generation?
For this particular location, I would say no. I will add to that, when we think of marine-based energy, clean energy, of course, we go immediately to offshore wind because that's the bread and butter. There are ways of capturing energy from wave motion. There's technologies for tidal energy. There's other marine-based technologies as well. But as you indicated, to capture, there are two ways to capture tidal. One would be if you have a tidal flow, and there are what look like wind turbines that are designed to be underwater. And they can be, these were tested some years ago in the East River off New York. They are attached to the bed, and they rotate when the tide's moving, and they generate electricity. Of course, when you put rotating equipment underwater, you're invariably going to have problems. So they haven't gone very far. The other way of doing that, as you suggested, is with an impoundment. And if you have, maybe a naturally occurring shoreline that lends itself to creating an impoundment and an open space where you can allow the water to flow in and out, and then you put a turbine there, that's another way to do it. But quite honestly, those are difficult projects to permit. They don't come close to the cost effectiveness as wind does. And solar is even now being considered as an opportunity for floating as well. Don't know if that'll go anywhere, but it's being studied.
Wouldn't a project like this have to go hand in hand with another major project to mitigate the erosion, sinking, rising waters, whatever you want to call it?
Along those lines, let me just go back up a couple slides. One of the reasons why we have considered deploying the turbines here, as I mentioned, it's as far away as we can get from the airport. So as far as the approaches and departures, it doesn't create a conflict. But the other reason is that the CBF is interested. They have a bit of a seawall here, as you can see, these structures here. And they've expressed an intent to build a stronger, sturdier, more robust infrastructure along there to protect this shore. And we have discussed the possibility of having an upgraded structure serve double duty. That is to protect that shoreline and at the same time provide foundations for the future turbines along there. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
I was referring more to the problem over in the population center of the rising water.
So are you asking that, wondering would it be prudent to go forward with a project like this? Yeah. Will you have a population to serve? The latest estimates are 50 years. The infrastructure we're talking about here has a lifetime on the order of 20 to 25 years. So if you believe the 50-year projection, we're good. But if you don't.
Thank you.
But yeah, no, you're welcome. That's a very good question, and it's one that we're going to have to really dig more into before you start spending millions on a project like this.
My question is, are considerations like cradle-to-cradle costs for these systems part of your research? In other words, in 25 years, you've got to, dispose of the batteries, do something with the blades, with all the equipment, infrastructure. When you say it's cost-effective, is that included in that formula or in those calculations?
It is, yeah, and that goes for any modern utility scale, I'll say, solar or wind project. They're never built without considering what we call the levelized cost of electricity. That is from development of a project, design, engineering, commissioning, operation through its life, and decommissioning. We got to go all the way through. And when we look at all those costs combined and consider that, and consider how much energy will be generated, we come up with a levelized cost. That's written right into permitting ordinances and other, the approval process requires that you consider how do you protect a community from a project being abandoned and ensuring that the community isn't footing the bill for decommissioning. So yes. The levelized costs, again, I have spreadsheets that we developed through Rabia's work, and the cost of electricity is comparable to, and in some cases, if we were to maintain a connection with the mainland, that cost would be lower than what they're paying otherwise.
I think we'll hold the rest of the questions, and I'm sure John is willing to stick around and answer any questions one-on-one if you want to continue the conversation. Great questions, great presentation. Please join me in thanking John for coming
Thank you all.
And just a reminder again, if you do have ideas about a speaker for next year, we'd be all ears.